Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 1 of the third round series between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues. And now for the third time in the row, the Sharks have managed to claim Game 1, this time, unlike the first two times, by a score of 6-3 instead of 5-2. The Sharks will now try to avoid going 3 series in a row with Game 2 losses, as they don't want to be having the split at home, which is what, in theory, the Blues were looking to do coming into these first couple games of the series. Now, the Sharks started off in these playoffs against the Golden Knights, a very aggressive team, and there was basically a scrum after every single whistle, fighting for space, hits flying everywhere. And so when the Sharks managed to knock off the Golden Knights and they moved into the series against the Colorado Avalanche, it was like a breath of fresh air. Like, it was such a new thing that the Sharks haven't seen in a while, considering that their last 3 playoff series was against the Golden Knights, and then going back to last year, the Golden Knights again, and the Ducks. And so a team against a team like the Avalanche, in which there's less hitting, it's more of a speed and skill type of game, a lot of stick checking when it comes to trying to defend, was definitely a breath of fresh air. But now we've arrived in the third round, facing off against the St. Louis Blues, and it seems like we are back to where we were against the Golden Knights. It's going to be a rough series. The Blues certainly taking advantage of the fact that the refs put the whistle away in the playoffs, taking a few extra runs at players. A couple times they're interfering with players ever so slightly, or maybe a bit more than ever so slightly. And it's annoying to deal with, certainly, but it is something that you encounter in the playoffs a lot. The Avalanche are actually one of the few teams that don't play in this regard. And so if the Sharks are to move on to the Stanley Cup Finals, they'll either face off against the Boston Bruins, who is a team who's going to do that exact same thing, or the Hurricanes, who probably would do the same. And so the Sharks have to deal with that, and probably what epitomizes that for the Blues in this game is that they pull the goalie in the last 5 minutes or so of this game, trying to tie it up, and eventually the Sharks manage to get the empty netter from Logan Couture, and the very next shift, the St. Louis Blues they have Sundqvist tackling Dillon, they have Bortuzzo punching Goodrow in the face. So the Blues play this type of way, and the Sharks will have to respond to it like they did against the Golden Knights. But in this game, the Sharks actually played very well, as they have in every Game 1, like I said, during these playoffs. The first period, while the Blues technically outshot the Sharks, I think 10-9, the Sharks had much better chances. The Blues really didn't get too much of anything. There was maybe like a couple of those 10 shots that were actually halfway decent. Logan Couture got the first goal of this game on a 2-on-1. Binnington, not much of a chance there. The Sharks actually managed to get to Binnington a bit in this game. Then it was Joel Edmondson tipping in a shot from Jaden Schwartz. Then it was Joe Pavelski on a 5-on-3. The Sharks finally get a 5-on-3. They were robbed of a couple of them during that Colorado series, but this time I think it was Evander Kane gets his stick sliced in half basically by Colton Parayko, who goes to the box to give the 5-on-3, and Pavelski makes it 2-1, and that's the score at the end of the first period. Second period comes along. Sharks still the better team mostly. They get a goal from Kevin Labanc to make it 3-1 before O'Reilly immediately responds to make it 3-2, before Timo Meier, with a beautiful move, is able to make it 4-2, and eventually he also gets another to make it 5-2, and that is the score going into the third period. And the Sharks do a pretty good job early on in this third period defending. Besides the Bozak line, Bozak, Maroon, and Thomas, who got a couple of very good shifts during the first 10 or 12 minutes of this third period, the Sharks were actually doing a great job at defending until finally on their third shift here, Bozak actually manages to break through and makes it 5-3, and that's when the Blues start to push. A couple minutes, a couple good chances, the Sharks hold them off, and then the Blues, as I said, go for the aggressive empty net pull with just under 5 minutes to go. Sharks kill off a couple of minutes before they get the Couture empty netter, and that was the game 6-3. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, who had a pretty solid game here tonight. I know a lot of people were upset with the first couple of goals. The first one certainly looked bad if it was just Jaden Schwartz, but it seems as though Joel Edmondson did get, I don't know if a stick or maybe a part of his body onto that puck, which at least explains it somewhat why Jones let this one in. For the O'Reilly one, I think it's important to realize that because of the fact that Vlasic gets pushed down here in front of the net, and then Joe Thornton sort of moves his way towards Sammy Blais to try and cover him defensively, it leaves Ryan O'Reilly all alone. And when the puck gets to a shooter, you're the goaltender, you're trying to challenge it there, because if you stay deep in your own crease, O'Reilly's just going to take a shot easily and score a goal from there. So you come out to challenge, you hope O'Reilly takes the shot, and in a normal circumstance, if he actually tries to go around you, you normally have a defender there to stop him. But in this case, because Vlasic was knocked down and Thornton went to Blais instead, of O'Reilly. O'Reilly basically had all the time in the world to go around Martin Jones, so I don't really blame him for that one. And of course, I don't blame him for the Bozak one either. So mostly it was a solid game. He also made a couple of huge saves there when the Blues had the goalie pulled to keep the Sharks with the 2-goal lead and allow them enough time to get Couture's empty netter. Next, I'll talk about the first line, who, as I said multiple times during the Avalanche series, that they were the most consistent line there, and they continue to just be fantastic during this first game. Couture had a very solid game. Meyer, of course, a couple of goals, one amazingly beautiful, fantastic move, the Peter Forsberg, as they call it, and one a bit more lucky. But, I mean, if there was a player on the Sharks who deserved a lucky break at a point in these playoffs, it would be Timo Meyer, with the amount of times he was basically robbed by both Fleury and Grubauer during the first couple of series. And even Nyquist has been surprisingly very strong on this first line. I mean, not surprisingly necessarily, but he hasn't had the greatest stint with the Sharks. He's been okay mostly since the trade deadline, but he's been a lot better here on this first line. Definitely playing well with Couture and Meyer, and this first line has been absolutely fantastic since the start of the Colorado series, basically. Next, I'll talk about Joe Thornton on a bit more of a sour note. Thornton, since I guess Game 1 against the Avalanche, hasn't looked that great. I believe he did get a point on the LeBanc goal, but he's been a bit rough defensively. It seems as though maybe the amount of games that the Sharks have played during these playoffs, he's played every single one. Of course, he played the majority of the regular season since, I guess, the end of October, when he was out about 9 games before coming back. Maybe, I mean, the Sharks would never rest Thornton at this point, or Thornton would never allow himself to be rested, but maybe the amount of games that he has played is catching up to him, because he does look a bit slower out there. There was a time he did beat somebody out for an icing, which was cool, but he's lost his man a couple times defensively, and the Sharks actually got punished on the O'Reilly one, because you'd maybe like Thornton to stay with O'Reilly there, because Blais wasn't as much of a danger, I would think, even if Vlasic was knocked down. And so you do hope that he brings it back. It was nice to see the third line actually get a goal in this game, because they haven't done anything since Game 1 against the Avalanche. And hopefully maybe Thornton can find his game a bit, maybe rest up a bit, so that third line can actually be apparent, because we saw the Blues' third line, the Bozak line, was actually very strong in that third period. The Sharks will need to match up to that. As I said, Sharks' depth is going to be key in this series. Finally, I'll mention Brendan Dillon. This one's not necessarily negative, but it is a bit of an odd thing to point out. So I had mentioned at the end of the last series that if Game 1 was going decently well for the Sharks, I could see DeBoer trying to give Ryan a few more minutes, and he did exactly that. Ryan got his most ice time since Game 4 against the Golden Knights with just about 10 minutes, which allowed Burns to still play a pretty hefty 24, but certainly not the amount that he has played during these playoffs in any normal game. But Brendan Dillon only got 14 and a half minutes. And so I've said multiple times that the Sharks are running a 5-man defensive core, but Brendan Dillon really isn't getting, I guess, his fair share of minutes. And it's fair to wonder, what is the reason for that? Especially since when you look at Vlasic, Karlsson, Burns, and Braun, who are the top 4 that the Sharks have rolling, 3 of them are right-handed defensemen. So there have been multiple times where we've seen a pairing of Karlsson, Braun, or Burns, Braun, and Vlasic can't necessarily share the love all that much as a left-handed defenseman. And so you do have to insert Dillon in there somewhere, and it was a bit of a surprise that Dillon only actually had 14 and a half minutes, and he hasn't been getting too much ice time during these playoffs. I thought he was mostly consistent for the majority of the year. He did fall off a bit near the end, and he wasn't great during the first round, but otherwise it is a bit of a surprise to see Dillon. I wonder if there's maybe some sort of injury dealing with him, or maybe just DeBoer really doesn't trust him all that much, trusts him more than Ryan, obviously, but it seems as though he's not really getting the same amount of ice time as some of the other defenders on this team. You'd think he'd get some penalty kill time, or with Burns and Karlsson playing so much at times, that he would maybe get a pairing with Braun or something, but I guess that just really hasn't happened all that much, and that has been, I guess, causing Brendan Dillon's ice time to not be as high as you maybe think, where it should probably be around the maybe 17 or 18 minute mark. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday for Game 2. As I said, the Sharks will try and avoid the same trap they've fallen into in the first couple of series in these playoffs. They lost Game 2 against the Golden Knights. They lost Game 2 against the Colorado Avalanche, and that basically nullifies the Game 1 victory. It doesn't matter how well you played. It doesn't matter by what score you get. It only counts as a single win in the series. And so if they give up Game 2 to the Blues, Game 1 basically sort of doesn't matter even at that point, and you're actually in a disadvantage because the other team will have the home ice advantage in the final best of 5 that comes to after you have a 1-1 series tied. So the Sharks will try for the first time in these playoffs to actually come out of the first 2 games with a 2-0 lead, which would be huge in trying to put the Blues away. And what the Sharks probably want to do at this point, especially as I said with the fatigue of some players and especially Joe Thornton, the Sharks will probably want to try and close out the Blues as fast as possible before a potential Stanley Cup Finals, and that would start with a Game 2 victory. Class dismissed.